And for us, we have these massively large, 1,700 columns are all joined together when it's said and done. And I think increasingly, we're going to need to say, hey, not only will an LLM not be able to answer 100% of our questions,
Yeah.
it won't be able to answer 90% of them unless we
Right.
curate quite a bit.
Right.
And so I think for us, we're thinking about how can we, pare down the total amount of data we have, write the joins and the documentation in a way that an LLM can read it,
Yep.
and then hopefully empower, the next generation of text to SQL on a much smaller subset of our total data.
Thanks very much, everyone, for listening in. This is the AI Adoption Playbook. I'm here with Ian from Ramp. You may well have seen or heard of some of the content that Ian has been putting out there about the amazing stuff Ramp has been doing, not just with Gen AI, but with educating the landscape, the market more generally about data and the incredibly interesting, frankly, data that Ian has at Ramp. Ian and I met at an investor dinner. Ian reminded me of that earlier. We were chatting a little bit about some of the work Ramp was doing on receipt matching. And I just thought it was really, really fascinating. You guys were, I think, one of the first companies to actually have production use cases for this stuff. So I think that was really cool. And I figured it would be really fun to have you on. Just for our audience, Ian, do you want to spend a minute just explaining who you are, what you do at Ramp? And we can go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for having me on. I'm Ian Macomber. I lead the data team at Ramp. Been there for just under 3 years. All my prior experience is in B2C e-commerce, so came in knowing a lot about product analytics, marketing analytics, very little about credit and underwriting and risk and fraud. It's in fintech and payment rails and enterprise sales. And then within Ramp, a lot of what we did was really building out feature parity with competitors.
Yep.
I think increasingly for us, we now have a data moat and a distribution moat.
Really
and
cool.
So when we think about what we can do with generative AI, there's all the normal use cases around, how do we make our own team more effective?
Right.
But I think increasingly we're trying to think, how can we build something that no one else can to help save our customers time and money with generative AI? So super happy to dig into it today.
Yeah, really, really cool. Excited to have you on. I think one of the things that I like to just start with is, what do you actually use AI for? I think we hear a lot about, we see a lot of these demos online, a lot of stuff looks flashy, but it can be hard for people to cut through the noise and figure out hey, is this actually creating value for you in your world? And then we can talk a little bit about what you guys see at Ramp as well, more broadly.
Yeah. So what I'm most excited about right now is I think maybe 4 years ago, you're like, who can implement large language models in industry? And maybe it's, 150 people.
Right.
And 2 years ago, you're like, okay, at a company like Ramp, it'd be the machine learning engineers, the senior MLEs.
Right.
I manage an analytics engineering team. We use DBT, we use BI tools, we write in SQL. What I'm excited about now is if you look at the advances of how easy it is to call these models and put them into a workflow, the most junior person on my team can leverage Cortex within Snowflake as part of DBT and in SQL.
Right.
And so the probably strongest opinion I have right now is for an analytics engineering workflow, right? It's not even applied ML, right?
Yep.
You've been able to do work in a CSV file with tabular data sets and sums for whatever, decades.
Yep.
You've really only been able to work closely with semi-structured data for 4 or 5 years. And I think over the last 3 months and sort of always going forward, just the analytics engineering workflow will increasingly include text and images and videos and contracts and PDFs.
Really cool.
The exact same way it's always included, CSV files.
It makes so much sense. And it's just kind of exciting to think about, there was so much value created by the analytics engineering industry in the last 10 years, but it was so limited in scope to just the super structured data, right? And now that that's kind of broken open, it's kind of crazy to imagine how much value we're going to see get created now that like the rest of the 90% of like the enterprise data is actually available for use here.
And for, not just 90% of the data, but, 100% of the data team, or instead of sort of the tip
Yeah.
of the spear AI engineers,
So true.
this is now something where really every single person who can write SQL, you can write SQL and you're a little resourceful and you want to watch a
Right.
YouTube video, you can build something leveraging large language models off the shelf.
That's really cool. What's the like coolest thing you've seen someone build? Maybe someone like who, like you say, is a little bit junior, isn't necessarily the like 10-year AI PhD guy or girl. Like, what's the coolest thing that you've seen someone like new to the problem be able to create?
So my favorite, and this is not necessarily cool in how cool it is, it's more just cool in how easy it is.
That's awesome.
Is we were able to build a retrieval augmented generation program using 26 lines of SQL.
Wow.
And you think about like what that would mean relative to like a year or two ago.
That's incredible.
And for us, I'll just give you an example. If you ask Facebook's Llama model, what is RAMP? It knows what RAMP is. It's been trained to that point.
Cool.
If you ask what is RAMP plus pricing, and you give it, the context around, don't hallucinate.
Right.
It says, I do not know RAMP plus pricing. But if you take our Gong transcripts and you just say, find me sentences that are semantically similar to RAMP plus pricing, it finds those. You add that in the context window. You then say, here are sentences that are like RAMP plus pricing.
Yep.
Put them into the context window. What is RAMP plus pricing? It says, RAMP plus pricing is $12 per user per month.
Really cool.
All 26 lines of SQL.
So cool.
And so that's the type of thing where, again, it's not, this is something you could have accomplished if you were an expert 3 years ago, if you were a senior MLE a year and a half ago. And now I just think the fact that any analytics engineer can do this is really powerful.
Yeah, that is so awesome. It has been really cool to see how, basically everyone has really done a great job, I think, of trying to democratize access to the technology. I think if you think about classic predictive models, it really took years and years and years before predictive models was something that like a SQL engineer could like use. I'm still not sure we even are there, frankly, right? So the fact that these like trillion parameter language models are there in like 2 years after like really the most of the world like woke up to the power is pretty awesome. I'm curious a little bit for you, like what does the AI stack that you're talking about like look like? So you mentioned writing in SQL. What are the tools that you guys are using to write that? You mentioned the Llama model. Curious how you thought about why you wanted to pick that versus the ChatGPTs, the Anthropics, et cetera, of the world.
Yeah, so I can talk about some of the evolution that we've had at Ramp, and also we have data on a lot of what Ramp customers are doing.
Really cool.
And the first thing I'll say is, and again, this is not, groundbreaking. Companies are designing their stacks to flip between foundational models extremely quickly.
Really cool.
And we see that in things like how many OpenAI customers are also spending on Anthropic is going up and up and up.
So interesting.
And so I think I would almost say the B2C analogy is I have Uber. I love Uber. I also have Lyft.
Right.
I check them both. I check them both almost every time, unless I don't know, it's like quick or cheap or anything. That's what we do internally, and it's what we see a lot of our customers do. And so to talk a little bit about receipt matching, this is one of the first times, we built out AI, took a dependency on scale.
Yeah.
They had a receipt matching project. We uploaded receipts, they would process them, something like, 10 cents an invoice. Eventually, GPT came out with a model that could do it better and cheaper, and it's more generalized.
Really cool.
Then eventually, 3.5 comes out.
Right.
And we're plotting points on an axis of how good is the model versus how expensive is the model.
Right.
Eventually, these models on that specific task just start to get to 100% accuracy.
Wow,
at that point, really, all you're competing on is cost.
Right.
And there's another sort of problem that was tough to solve that is now easy to solve, where you're plotting, again, like how effective it is and how expensive it is.
Yep.
And so really, the only constant for us has been, let's assume these models are only going to get faster, more powerful, and cheaper. That's how we design, and that's also how we see Ramp customers design.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. I'm curious, like, one of the things that's very interesting to me is it feels like this phenomenon that you're talking about, which I see everywhere, that customers really are designing to be like very model agnostic early on. It seems very different to me to, for example, like the cloud or the data infrastructure wave, right? Where like people picked Snowflake or Databricks or Palantir, or people picked AWS or GCP, and then they basically got stuck with them, right? And like it became like this 5-year migration project if you want to change. Why do you think that's been different this time? Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, I think it probably has to do with sort of state versus lack of state.
Yeah.
If you call a model,
Yeah.
you upload a receipt, loosely the assumption is you'll get the same answer, and over time it'll be more accurate.
Yep.
But you don't necessarily get a ton of additional benefit
Interesting.
on context, right? These are
Right.
relatively stateless API calls versus something like a Snowflake or Azure or GCP. Once you have built some piece of it, you get a little bit of vendor lock-in. I think the same way that, if I called an Uber earlier today, it doesn't mean that I'm going to call necessarily an Uber or Lyft based on anything other than my next interaction.
Right.
So we'll see if that changes in the future, but I think building out more context such that maybe you do get better answers or more of an understanding as you use the product more, I think that's probably what you'd have to believe to start seeing a little bit more lock-in.
Yeah, it's been really interesting, right? Because obviously enterprises have pushed back really strongly against the idea of these foundation models training on their data, right? For really obvious reasons. I think that makes it quite difficult, it seems, for those foundation models to do what you're saying, which is like get better as you use them more, right? Given that constraint, like, where do you think the foundation models go, right? Like, how do you actually, like, build an enterprise, like, defensible business in the context of, like, everything is extremely, interchangeable?
Yeah, I mean, I think an analogy for me might be Hadoop
Yep.
6 years ago, or maybe streaming data 3 years ago, where, you think about, could you process a billion rows of event stream data 6 years ago? And the answer was sort of loosely yes, but you probably needed to have a couple of database administrators spin it up and one manage it in perpetuity.
Makes sense.
So Uber had this stuff, but it was not yet turnkey. And then I think about analytics engineering stack, dbt, Snowflake, Fivetran. You can set up your stack with a credit card over the course of an hour.
Right.
I think it's a little bit analogous here, which is there's a lot that every company wants to do. We're thinking about, how do we leverage Slack? How do we leverage emails? How do we leverage calendars for context? As you start to build that out and make it turnkey, where you do not need a ton of resources to spin it up, I think that's largely how, and it's not really a foundational model question as much as like a company intelligence question, but I think that's sort of how you sink your fangs into an industry and start to have a little bit more lock-in.
Totally makes sense. So I think that's it's very cogent, actually. One of the things I'm kind of curious for you, so you guys see at Ramp this sort of distribution of what companies are spending on, right? And you mentioned this interesting sort of paradox of people were spending, like, I can't remember exactly how you phrased it, but like people were buying OpenAI or Anthropic, and now they're like buying tokens. I'm curious, like, do you see that varying between the sort of developer use cases and the kind of end user use cases? Do you see a lot of customers that are using ChatGPT Enterprise and Anthropic Enterprise, but then also on the developer side, like swapping in between the foundation models? Or is that like interchangeability primarily on the like developer application side?
It's definitely in both. And so the metrics that we like to track, I love the fact that we have these time series panel data. And so one of the first things we look at is, of those that pay someone in a month, how many of them are paying the same entity 12 months from now?
Right.
So you loosely call that retention.
Makes sense,
And a lot of kind of the point solution AI tools don't actually have super sticky retention.
Oh, really?
Right?
Wow.
Where they come out of an experimental budget, you play around with them, and then they go away. We've really noticed that, obviously OpenAI and Anthropic, very, very high retention. But then the other thing you start to notice is card spend we would loosely consider to be smaller amounts, a little bit more experimental in budget. And most importantly, it's sort of after the fact, right? Versus if you are paying something on bill pay, it actually means that it's going to go through procurement. You're going to think about the capacity you're going to use. You're going to sign, DSAs and MSAs and DS, all that stuff.
Legal fun stuff.
Exactly. And so mostly we just really see that the spend is becoming operational, and
Really
it is being managed the exact same way, obviously,
right.
an AWS bill or rent would be.
Right. That's actually really, really, really interesting. I'm curious if like the if you see the experimental budgets going away, or is it still the case that like experimental budgets are growing? It's just that people are figuring out how to translate the experimental stuff into operational stuff and then it becomes sticky? Or is it actually that like the experimental budgets have gone down and like the crystallized operational use cases are kind of dominating like the actual spend metrics?
I think the experimental budgets are definitely still there.
Cool.
And to sort of both plug Ramp and plug some of the services
Yeah.
we offer, being good at procurement ends
Yep.
up increasingly being an advantage.
Right.
And
Makes sense.
when our developer, like we've seen Cursor absolutely rip as a new
Really cool.
vendor, right?
Really
Like
cool.
we saw 60 businesses on Ramp paying for it, then 200 the following month, then 600 the month after.
That's so cool.
And you think about that, right? It's
Yep.
a pull from the developers. If you want to have a world-class engineering team, I'm not necessarily saying you need to use Cursor, but I am saying
Sure.
if you can't get Cursor in the hands of your engineering teams in 2 months, like what are you even doing?
Right.
This stuff is moving so fast that you are like engineering salaries are so expensive and
Right.
you're not going to be able to get them a $20 a month or whatever Cursor
Right.
charges as subscription to supercharge them. And so I think being able to buy quickly
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
extremely important. Unquestionably, we're not going to know who the winners are in this space. You don't need to pick the winner. I think you just really need to move quickly on procurement and kind of also recognize in many of these situations, if you pick a tool for 2 years, build a lot, get it a little bit wrong and flip, it's actually not that much of a negative situation. And so
Cool.
I'd say like enabling your team to be quick to try these tools out and figure out which ones are working
Yeah.
is super important.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a ton of sense. Like, I think there's sort of two components to that, right? One is being able to buy the thing quickly, and the other thing is being able to figure out if it's working or not, right? Do you want to double down on this thing that you experimented with, or actually do you want to kind of keep exploring in the space? How are you guys thinking about that? Like, what are the fun tools that you're experimenting with? Are you using Cursor yourself?
I'm using Cursor. I use it
Nice.
to write documentation.
And how does it compare to Copilot for you?
I think the main difference is sort of like if you start with writing code and hit tab, or
Right.
you just sort of hit Command K and just
Right.
start typing in English text.
Right.
That's mostly why I use it. I mean, mostly I just highlight big chunks and I say write documentation for me. And
Oh, that's so
it
nice.
does a pretty good job.
That's really, really
Yeah.
cool. Yeah, I can see how at a company like Ramp. How many people are you guys now?
We're just over 1,000 now.
1,000 people. Wow, that's so crazy. How old is the company?
Just over 5 years.
Just 5 years. Wow. So that's a pretty crazy growth rate. How long have you been at Ramp?
I've been there 3 years.
3 years. And what has that like transition been like for you? Has it been kind of chaotic? I imagine that when you go through those sorts of crazy growth periods, even for us, it's been like really crazy going from like 2 people to like 15 in the last 12 months. I
Yeah.
can't even imagine what it's like going from a couple hundred to 1,000, right?
So you probably won't believe me. It doesn't feel all that different. And I think
Wow.
the reason why is we believe so strongly in small, cross-functional, single-threaded teams.
Really cool.
And we've just really, once a team hits 12 people, just
Yeah.
broken it into 2 teams.
Really cool.
And so the atomic units are definitely still the same. We launched a travel product
Right,
recently.
yeah.
That team sits together.
Really
They have
cool.
their part of the office. There's a bunch of cool travel stuff around there.
Really cool.
And it feels quite similar to how Ramp did right when I joined.
Right.
I think mostly the big difference is once you get everyone together in a room,
Right.
you're sort of like, oh my God, like what have we become? But I think, trying to keep that velocity. And,
Yeah.
and I'll also say the big difference is probably when I joined, to an extent,
Yeah.
we were a corporate card company competing in the corporate card category
Right.
against other corporate cards.
Right.
Now we're a finance platform.
Right.
I'm like,
right.
what the hell does that mean? We have to spend a lot more time educating, creating awareness,
Exactly.
especially as hopefully we keep doing this, building N-of-1 products that
Right.
is not feature parity with a competitor,
Right.
but is something that only we can do
Makes total sense.
because of a combination of our data and our distribution and our engineering skill.
Really.
So hopefully we spend more time educating and creating awareness about what we're building.
Really cool. One of the things I'm curious about, you have this like very cool, like lean, small team philosophy. Does that feed into your procurement process as well? Like when you're buying AI tools or tools of any sort, really, are you leaving those procurement choices, the experimental choices, up to like each individual team? Do you have a centralized AI like governance body at Ramp? Like, how does that work?
Definitely a little bit different for the specific tool. And
Got it.
to your point on governing body, probably the axes would be, to what extent does this need to be a company-wide decision? What are the ramifications one way or another?
Right.
But we've always organized more around problems than tooling. And so an example would be our credit team
Yep.
really needs to have an understanding of what's in someone's bank account
Makes sense.
because we do cash flow based accounting.
I would hope that they do have a good understanding of that.
We work on it. And we do not, for example, have, a Finicity team or a Teller team or a Plaid team.
Right.
We have an engineering team.
Yep.
And they can build in-house, they can buy, they can flip between models if they want.
Right.
We are, we say no one at Ramp other than you is going to be incentivized and tasked with understanding what's in a customer's bank account.
Yep.
And we'll let you make those build or buy decisions.
Really cool.
And generally we like to have engineers make them.
Got it. Okay. So it sounds like in general, those sorts of things are decentralized whenever they can be.
Whenever they can be.
Yeah. So do you have any like centralized AI tools that everybody at the company is using? Or is that like still like, it's still in the like case that most teams are just figuring it out for themselves?
We've decided how much of our total docs we want to index on it.
Right.
But definitely we use Guru. So it's really, really helpful for our sales team.
Nice.
Really helpful for our customer service team.
Really cool.
And then we also have a podcast that's all done by AI.
Oh, nice.
Where it just takes 5-minute chunks of various calls with customers over the course of the week, package them into 5 minutes, and we just hear, and you can kind of tune it either way, either like the stuff people have really enjoyed about Ramp, or the stuff that they've hated. And we really like to listen to both of them.
Oh, that's really powerful, actually. I love the idea of creating a podcast out of your customer transcripts. Are you using the like Google Notebook Colab product for that? Or?
Yeah, I know the one you're talking about. I think we actually built it before that was out.
So
cool.
we
have not been, but we have played around with that for other things, like just reading off documents.
Nice, makes sense. I think it's the one that went viral when the AIs like kind of realized that they were like AIs and they were like told they were being deleted and they got kind of sad and meta about it. Yeah. Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense. It's cool that it sounds like there's a handful of things that you guys are using. You mentioned like this sort of notion of your corporate docs and what do you want to index? Where do you want those index data to be available? And it was sort of interesting because you also earlier kind of hinted at like thinking of that problem as like the core value like question. I'd love to get a sense of, how are you guys thinking about what data is valuable to connect to these AI models and how are you going about figuring that out and actually doing that connection?
Yeah, this is an area where I'm extremely curious. I don't know the right answer, and I think we will in 2 or 3 years.
Cool.
Like, you can't not have an opinion if you lead a data team on text to SQL.
Right.
People are like, how are we going to empower people? Let them talk, get what they need in SQL. We read the papers. A lot of the papers, are like, we can generate 92% of SQL queries correctly. And you're like, awesome. And then you read them and you're like, you have 4 tables. They have 6 columns each and they're named correctly.
Right.
That's not what our database looks like.
Right.
We have 133,000 columns.
Right.
Our bill pay table has 15 timestamps and we need all of them sometimes.
Right.
And so I think whether you are writing docs for internal consumption or you're writing documentation for a data model, increasingly human beings are going to have to be good at anticipating how can I write this in a way that an LLM will be able to take that context. And so for us, if you're kind of familiar with like Kimball modeling.
Actually, for the audience, do you want to kind of explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so the kind of concept is in SQL, you'll have a relational database. You might have transactions in the middle, and that will consist of items in a table and users and businesses and customers, and you'll all kind of join together. And for us, we have these massively large, 1,700 columns are all joined together when it's said and done. And I think increasingly, we're going to need to say, hey, not only will an LLM not be able to answer 100% of our questions, it won't be able to answer 90% of them unless we curate quite a bit. And so I think for us, we're thinking about how can we, pare down the total amount of data we have, write the joins and the documentation in a way that an LLM can read it, and then hopefully empower, the next generation of text to SQL on a much smaller subset of our total data.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. So what are you using to do that? Are you creating DBT models that you're exposing to the LLMs? Like, how are you thinking about like doing that paring down process?
So we are still very much in kind of the test and learn phase
Cool.
here. Like everyone, or not like everyone, but the first semantic layer at a lot of companies is in Looker, and it
Yep.
is the case for us.
Makes sense.
I do not think everyone's semantic layer will be in LookML 2 years, 3 years from now.
That sounds about
Uh,
right to me. Yeah.
I haven't seen where it's congealing yet, though.
Right.
And so this is one where, I mean, to be totally honest with you, I took like the first 5 text to SQL meetings that
Right.
people offered me,
Right.
and now there's like, we just don't take them anymore.
That makes
Um,
so much sense.
so I'm gonna wait till someone congeals around.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense. I'm curious. Like, I guess that the text to SQL thing is like so crazy now. I feel like I see a new text to SQL startup pop up like every week at this point. Do you have a sense of what you're even looking for? Like, what would a good version of this be? Like, how would it be different to like everything else?
I mean, this is a phrase I love for self-service data
Right.
is there's a concept of induced demand.
Yeah, yeah, love
And
it.
so from, traffic, right? You're like,
Right.
there's a bunch of traffic on this 2-lane highway.
Right.
Let's build some more lanes. And then you're like, more people drove, traffic got worse. That's what I think self-service data always will be.
Right.
And that's why data teams are safe. Is
Right.
as you make things more self-serve, human nature is, as it rightfully should be,
Right.
to kind of push up the edge of complexity as to
Yeah.
what you can do. And once you get stuck, you ask the data team some questions.
Right.
And I think what we're left with is increasingly the hard questions. I don't think text to SQL will be perfect. I think there will always be scenarios where people get it wrong. But for me, I think a better way for a median employee on a median topic to
Yep.
be able to answer 95% of their questions
Yep.
would be a great start for me.
Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense. I think one of the things I hear a lot of people like worry about with text to SQL is obviously it's quite easy. You gave the example of like 19, I think, different timestamps on
Yeah.
on a bill pay, right? And so it's quite easy for a text to SQL model to just pick the wrong timestamp to do the filter from. So someone's like, "Hey, show me all the payments that were initiated after this date," and it picks like the wrong date timestamp to use for that filter. But then that kind of mistake is very difficult for a non-technical employee to actually understand and be like, okay, like this particular answer is going to be wrong because it picked this like strangely named column from this like 130,000 like list of columns. How do you think about trying to manage that kind of scariness for your end users, like the people kind of inducing the demand, as you said?
So I think a decent analogy here is sort of bumper rails.
Right, right.
And so a lot of our tools do give you the ability to sort of softly nudge or
Nice.
aggressively nudge people into
Right.
making the right decision.
Makes sense.
And just so some examples, right, are most people at Ramp don't actually ever want to see transactions that didn't clear.
Right. Makes
So an
sense.
example would be if you put a credit card down at a
Right.
hotel,
Right.
$500 goes on your card, $500 comes off when you check out.
Yep.
It's just not really something we count.
Yep.
If you are a certain operator wanting to know something about, declines or holds, or hey, my limit didn't work because there was this other thing, you might need to answer that. But we nudge people very aggressively into starting their query
Really cool.
with those filters on there. And I think the same thing is probably true for something like timestamps. We're like,
Yeah.
hey, we're going to nudge you very aggressively towards this timestamp.
Yeah.
If you know the reason you don't want to use this timestamp,
Yep.
use one of the other 14. If you don't, use this one.
I mean, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's funny how often the concept of guardrails comes up. I feel like I'm not sure if you use the exact word guardrails, but like certainly there's an idea here of how do you stop the end user from kind of damaging themselves in some way. And that can be true in text to SQL. It can be true in like how do you stop the customer support bot from like accidentally giving away free flights. And also, how do you stop, customer facing interactions from being offensive, being just false, and the like various legal hallucination cases as well. So that's been kind of interesting from my perspective. It's just how this concept of guardrails, I think really early on in the industry, people understood it was important. And now gradually we're just seeing more and more of the specific ways in which those guardrails actually matter. And that's actually a really interesting, like very specific example. It's kind of cool. Curious also for you guys, you talk about centralizing data across all of these things. Where do you feel like the most exciting, most interesting data to like make these foundation models like more valuable, like even just for you and your operational like work at Ramp? Where does the data for that live, and how are you thinking about like getting all of that together and connecting it to the foundation models?
I think the first thing I would tell you, and this sort of sounds obvious after you say
Right.
it, but you have to work hard to get the data you need.
Right.
And I'll give you an analogy on a net promoter score survey.
Yeah.
Right when I joined Ramp, they said, hey, we want to see how our NPS scores are doing.
Right.
We used a tool, and you sort of looked in the tool and you're like, we sent out 600 surveys once and never used the tool again.
Right.
So you're like, okay, this, we obviously not helpful.
Right.
We need a bit of a program here. We
Right.
need to have a plan for how we ask this. And only after asking the questions correctly, the same way for 12 months, could we possibly understand
Right.
year over year NPS data.
Right.
And for a lot of scenarios, people say, hey, we have all these sales call transcripts.
Interesting.
I want to figure out how people heard of Ramp.
Yep.
Very easy to ask that question of the sales transcripts.
Yep.
Our sales team doesn't ask people how they heard about Ramp.
Right.
And I think it's again, so obvious, but like being really clear about what questions you want to ask and
Yep.
working with the teams upstream of you to generate the text
Super
data that you're
interesting.
interested in. It sounds so trivial, but it's really important to have a sense of this the same way that in that NPS example,
I love that.
you
Yeah.
can't do anything if you sent out your survey one time and then never did it again.
100%. So, like, who do you think is actually, like, within an organization, how do you think about making sure that someone is thinking through, like, hey, there's this new technological shift that's happening. It probably changes the set of data or the types of things that are valuable to the org, and therefore, like, in the long term, what we're able to do. Like, how should people think through being ahead of that and making sure that they're proactive about being like, hey, we should be collecting these new types of data because of this technological shift?
Kind of going back to that scale example from earlier.
Yeah, yeah.
This was a company that had an entire service that was all around taking receipts and understanding the context.
Makes sense.
Then they got blown out of the water by a general, not blown out of the water, but like a generalized approach was sufficient to this. The idea of a point solution
Right.
that can take an image and tell you what's in it.
Right.
You're like, this is a generalized problem. It's not a receipt problem anymore.
Right.
And for Ramp, we are starting to see the first layer of new companies come up and try to do some stuff that we can. And an example, right, is we know a ton about general ledger accounting and which
Right.
categories go where.
Right.
If you fly on Delta, we say we've seen 1 million accountants.
Right.
We know how to classify that. That's travel.
Right.
If you ask ChatGPT how to classify it,
Yep.
it'll probably know too.
Right.
You can build a very, very thin layer on
Right.
top of ChatGPT and say, we can categorize your expenses.
Right.
So then you really have to think, okay, like what is durable here?
It's so interesting.
And I think for us, it's sort of like not the easy stuff. It's the stuff in the middle, or it's the stuff that compounds, or it's the stuff that's hard.
Right.
Every day, there's a first transaction from a vendor on Ramp.
Makes sense.
Oftentimes like an indistinguishable one where we have no idea.
Right.
It's like, that's actually an opportunity for us.
Right.
Because we can maybe nudge the customer and say, we don't know about this. Will you
Right.
give us more context? The 10th time it happens,
Right.
we have that context.
Really cool.
And that's something where I think finding those flywheels is super important in a lot of what we focus on.
One of the things that's very interesting to me about the story that you just told is that ultimately access to the end user and being like having that direct ability to collect that context is sort of really, really central. Where if you're purely just like some middleware layer or, you're in the wrong part of the stack, you just don't have the ability to make sense of that new information that's coming into you.
I think that's right.
That's super interesting. I'm curious, like for you guys at Ramp, like when you think about the ways in which AI is like a threat to your business, and in the example that you created, but also like an opportunity for your business, how do you think about like what are the ways in which AI like accelerates Ramp, and then what do you want to do about that, and what are the ways that you want to think about the ways in which AI like maybe makes part of your business that was like a sensible thing for you to invest in, like less meaningful to invest in today?
A phrase that I love is, build what is necessary and
Right.
strategic, buy what is necessary and not strategic and
Cool.
ignore everything else.
Nice. Love it.
And so an example of this is Gong gets better and better and better
Really cool.
every week
Nice.
at sales transcripts. That's not something that I think we need to dedicate
Right.
a ton of time to.
Makes total sense.
We can take a dependency on them. We can bet on them to get better. I think for us, from the compound company perspective, it is cheaper and more trivial than ever to spin up a minimum viable product,
Yep.
right?
Totally makes sense.
And where I think we can really build something that is hard to copy
Yep.
is how can we have the context across all of our various pieces come together in a way that a point solution can't.
Yep.
And so an example that I love here is if we do a travel offsite,
Yeah.
we can plug into an org chart. If it's an engineering travel offsite, we can take everyone in my boss's org,
Right.
give them all a travel card, unless they already live in Miami, if the offsite's there, because we know that too.
We're actually doing an offsite in Miami next week.
That's awesome. It's funny, they only happen in the winter.
Very true.
And we can take that, you can say, this is only going to be useful for air and ground transit.
Right.
You can lock the cards, 1 or 2 days after the offsite. All of it can already be coded to the right thing. And that only really works because we have a couple of different components and modules that are all built with each other in mind. That ability to kind of go release that N of one next product wedge. And so I think really building cross-functionally as opposed to plugging into a whole bunch of other pieces is really going to be that compelling advantage.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, you've created, as you said, this data moat and this distribution mode, and it's a question of thinking through, like, how do you extend and exploit like that advantage that you've created rather than, where are you going to be playing catch up to, whatever other things already exist.
Yep.
Really cool. Yeah, super, super interesting. Last two questions. These can get kind of pretty philosophical. Do you have a thesis or an expectation about whether AGI is going to happen in, next 5 years, next 10 years, next 20 years?
The only thing I'm sure of is that we'll change the goalposts. And I don't know. I think there was a time period where I look back to when I graduated from college, and it was a time period where everyone could build on their MacBook a program in Python that could beat anyone in the world in chess.
Right.
But Go was unsolved.
Right.
And there was that interesting, I guess, 15 to 20 year period where like chess, solved problem, Go, unsolved problem. We'll never beat Go. Then we beat Go.
Really
It'll
cool.
be something else. So we'll see.
I actually had at a really dark moment the other day where someone tweeted at me, a friend of mine tweeted at me because we both had kids at around the same time. And he tweeted something saying like, do you ever think about the fact that our kids will literally never be as smart as the like most intelligent available large language model in their time? I'm still not sure I really believe him, but I'm also not sure if it's just wishful thinking on my part. Do you think that we will be at a point where you would reasonably look at a large language model and say like, this is like as smart as like a median person that you might interact with? Are we there already? Are we near there? Like, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it, for me, always comes back to you're always just predicting the median next token at the end of the day. That's what the math behind it is. If you need median outcomes, and that's not to say these things can't do incredible things. They obviously can. A lot of phenomenal PhD work or math groups, they can clearly discover new things with median outcomes. I think their ability to sort of drive a median outcome, I think unquestionably they're already well beyond PhD researchers in many aspects.
Really cool. I think I saw an interview with Ilya where he was kind of talking through this, and his sort of counter argument to this is, well, one way of thinking about how you get a foundation model to go past its sort of median outcome, if you like, is if you train it on enough data, it develops a like meaningful enough kind of world model. You can say, okay, what would like an IQ 100 person say to this? What would an IQ 130 person say to this? And then what would an IQ 250 person say to this? And in theory, if it's like world model is good enough, it can kind of extrapolate from like the way in which the answer changes as you go from IQ 100 to 160 to like what would that change extrapolated out to like the future. Best guess on whether that kind of superhuman intelligence is possible or not.
I think actually a question we ask data scientists sometimes,
Right.
right, is you're like, what are some of the differences between
Yeah.
a linear model versus a tree-based model?
Right.
And if you think about a linear model, let's use like Zillow's estimate, right?
Yeah.
Say you are only trained on bedrooms of, you know, 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, 4 bedrooms,
Yeah.
and linear, right?
Yep.
You could toss it a 7 bedroom
Right.
and it would say this is the
Right.
relationship between an incremental, and it
Right.
would continue to extrapolate. It might be wrong, it might be right, but it would go that far.
Yep.
If you have a tree-based model, it's not going to do that.
Right.
It will take you to the edge and say, this is, what we
Yep.
see for a 4, but I don't know what a 7 looks like,
Super
and I
interesting.
can't extrapolate. And so I'm sure it's not sort of totally analogous, right? But I think there is a distribution of writing
Right.
in the world, and a lot of it comes from people who are 100 IQ.
Sure.
I don't know if any of it comes from people who are 250 IQ. I don't know if there are people who are
Right.
1,000 IQ. And so thinking, is this person imitating a data set that does exist or does
Right.
not exist? Is there a training set of like latent writing
Right.
for like 250 IQ people out there? I'm not sure if there is.
I guess the question is like, are there non-linearities? So there's certainly writing for pretty much every like IQ, so to speak, or maybe just writing skill between like median writer to like, Shakespeare, let's say. Now the question is, can you extrapolate from like that change to what like, someone who was like 3 times better than Shakespeare would be
Yeah.
like as a writer? And yeah, open question. I'm still skeptical myself, but
Yeah.
okay, awesome. And then last question, what are you most excited to build next with AI? Like, what have you not done yet that you really want to get your hands on?
I am really excited to elevate Ramp's external data brand.
Really cool.
And so when I think about Zillow, it's like
Yeah.
you would never go to an open house without checking the Zestimate first.
Nice.
Zillow doesn't sell Zestimates. Zillow sells buyer's agents leads and they
Right.
sell mortgage leads. For us, we actually just hired an economist. We are
Really
just
cool.
starting to work on our, ramp.com/data. I do not want you to be able to spend money as a customer without checking to see like how would Ramp recommend this happens first.
Oh, that's so cool.
There's a lot of AI to this. There's a lot of SQL to this as well.
Yeah.
For the most part, it is saying, how can we take the context and documents around how a company spends,
Yeah.
what the line items are, what processes they go through, who makes the decisions, what axis are we even deciding on,
Right.
and bundle that up in a way that's sort of interpretable, lets companies benchmark.
Really cool.
And I think really the way I'll maybe describe, our travel product a little bit. We built it. We asked 50 friendly companies. We're like, hey, just give us your travel policies. We have a sense of the axes of a travel policy now.
Nice.
We built it to be configurable. Smaller companies come up to us. They're like, I don't have a travel policy. Like, you're Ramp. Just tell me what to do.
Right.
If I
right.
IPO one day,
Really
I'm
cool.
not going to think about how my travel policy got there.
Right.
And so that is something where we want to free people up to do work that is, again, like necessary
Yeah.
and strategic.
Yeah. Really cool.
We want to attack, again, going back to that median concept, anything where you want a median outcome to
Yeah.
occur. You're buying Figma, like
Great.
median outcome. Like just make sure it works, get me a fair price.
Right.
Let me go do something that's strategic. That's the stuff that I think we're really excited about solving with AI.
We're just dealing with a sort of, I don't know if this is exactly analogous, but we've been interviewing a lot recently. Some of those interviewees come from, they fly in from, whatever other parts of America or Canada. And someone asked me on our team, like, hey, what should our interview expenses policy be? And I was like, well, I have no idea what our interview expenses policy should be. I know we should have a policy, but, I'm obviously not like the right person to like come up with a perfect answer to that. And yeah, if like Ramp could just tell me like, hey, if you're a 15-person startup in New York, typically you're willing to expense $300 in travel for an interview. That would actually
be higher than that.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Like that would be like the car parking for the day, right? But
Yeah.
no, you're totally right. And then obviously, whenever you're trying to buy software, you're immediately hit by the like enterprise sales pricing page, which is like basically 3 question marks, right?
And if you're gonna have a candidate fly out,
Right.
don't have it during Fashion Week or the Model event.
Right.
That's when hotel prices are crazy.
Yeah.
So we know this.
That's
Yeah.
really cool. It's really, really cool. I mean, I can already see that being like super valuable just at Creo and
Yeah.
I extrapolate that out to every other company. Thank you so much, Ian. I really, really appreciate you coming on. Is there anything that you want to plug for the audience? Any place that they can look you up or learn more about what you guys are building?
Ramp.com.
Nice. Really, really cool. Thank you so much. And thanks, the audience, for listening in.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers, guys.